early African societies and the Bantu migrations. Our next unit. In this unit, we'll look at two subjects, two different groups. The ancient Egyptians, you can see there some of their famous pyramids on the right, and the Bantu migrations, one of the most significant overall developments economically, demographically, etc., of the ancient period in Africa. Egypt first, and then the Bantu peoples. The gifts of the Nile, ancient Egyptian civilization. And this is sort of the next stage of development of agrarian empire. We'll see other large-scale, very wealthy agrarian empires, but this is the first really big one that we're going to cover. We saw the origins of empire in Mesopotamia, but that was much smaller scale than what we're seeing now, and the scale is going to grow as we move around the world, eventually getting to the Chinese Empire and others beyond that, Roman Empire later on. The gifts of the Nile, of course, refers to the river, which the whole civilization was built around. It was crucial to the wealth, success of the Egyptian government, pharaoh, and to the wealth of the kingdom as well. So the Nile did give the Egyptians many gifts, and we'll see at least a few of those as we go along. You can see already some of the distinctive and well-known artwork of the ancient Egyptian period. And this is at the bottom of the screen. It's not just the next stage of agrarian empire, but it's a kingdom or an empire that shows an enormous amount of stability over about 1,000 years of time. There are some exceptions, but the exceptions kind of prove the rule. There's two exceptions. Some historians talk about hydraulic despotism. I left the P out of despotism, I see. But hydraulic despotism, which is another way to say something I alluded to in the previous slide, and that is that the powerful empire, the powerful government, as we'll see, from the top down, starting with the pharaoh. Despotism means kind of top-down authoritarian control. Could only be done, at least as effectively it was done, and on such a large scale, by making full use of the Nile River and control of that river. So Egypt's agrarian empire had sort of the hydraulic, basis that many such empires, as we'll see, have. Norman Cantor, great scholar, expert on the Middle Ages, but wrote a really good book also you see here called Antiquity, the Civilization of the Ancient World. He says, the center of Egyptian life geographically and in a broader cultural sense was the Nile River. Toward the end of the 4th millennium BC, the Egyptians came down from the hills bordering the Nile to farm the fertile land along the river. Their dikes, meaning like dams, transformed the marshes along the river in fertile fields. Every summer, the Nile overflowed its banks, submerging the fields. When the river receded in the fall, it left a deposit of fertile silt carried down from the mountains, and crops were sown in the rich brown fields. Egyptian society and government were molded by the river and the desert. That last part there, last sentence, Egyptian society and government were molded by the river and outside of it by the desert. Desert giving them natural boundaries against invasion. Not perfect boundaries against invasion, but making it hard to invade. The river, we already know, the sort of the center, the centerpiece of everything that would come to be the rich and powerful kingdom. In the sources of social power, Michael Mann, a noted a sociologist, says the irrigation agriculture was decisive in generating civilization, stratification, and the state in Egypt. No one has ever doubted it. Throughout ancient history, the Nile Trench supported the highest population density known to the world. One irrigation filled up the trench, productivity grew, so did civilization, stratification, and the state. The process was as in Mesopotamia, but squared. So again, much bigger than what was happening in Mesopotamia, though some of the same developments. So productivity, a huge amount of economic output and wealth creation. Stratification means this was a top-down, unequal society, a great deal of inequality, especially with the pharaoh being all-powerful or having absolute power. Looking at the political geography of ancient Egypt, it's a funny-shaped kingdom, to be certain. On the left slide there, if you can call this a country, let's just call it a country for the second. But if this was a country today, it would look like the borders would be what you see in green. The Nile Delta, right, has sort of a wide area with people settling there, a number of towns you can see in their tiny little red dots. But after you get past the Delta, the fertile soil, and that's where everybody lived, was just on one side or the other of the Nile. So their civilization, once you get past or south of the Nile Delta, was this thin strip of land. On either side is the desert that we just mentioned, that provided one of a number of natural barriers to invasion. The kingdom of Kush, below that, at the bottom of that same map, is also further down the Nile. They were, for a long time, separate, independent from Egypt, but the two warred against each other. Sometimes one was victorious, sometimes the other, but Egypt eventually, much later, conquered Kush. We're going to talk about the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms, the way that historians have kind of categorized and split up ancient Egypt to make sense of it, though there are also two intermediate periods we'll see, the first one between the Old and Middle, and the second one, of course, between the Middle and the New. There's actually a third intermediate period after the New Kingdom, but we're not going to get into that. The general or overall key, and again, at its most broad, between sort of the Old, Middle, New Kingdoms, which you see in the yellow, in their intermediate periods, you see in the pink, is a fluctuation, as it says, between centralization and decentralization of power. So in the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms, power was firmly centralized in the under the control of the pharaoh and his government. In the intermediate periods, temporarily centralized power broke down, and there was decentralization, which means there's no real center of power, at least not one that's effectively centering or centralizing the country or kingdom. Their sort of power has sort of devolved to local and regional levels, though in neither of the decentralization can sometimes work, and has in history, does sometimes now in the modern world, as a way to organize politically. But here in Egypt, both of them are rather tumultuous times, both of the intermediate periods, at least the two we're going to talk about. So the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms, which comprise 30 separate dynasties, and we're not going to get into the different dynasties. You can kind of see a chronology of them in the lower right there, so you could look at them if you wanted to. It is one of the really complicating features of Egyptian history, but we don't need to get into that much detail in a broad sweep overview like this course. So we will deal with some of the chronology of ancient Egypt, and in the slide in the upper right, the map, but the chronological table or chart there, it would, I think, behoove you to at least sort of know roughly sort of when things happened, and looking at that. And I'm not going to read these, but the Old, Middle, and New Kingdom you see with prominent features of each one on the left. Those I'll talk about some things within that as we go along, but that wouldn't be a bad thing to study on its own when you get to that point. As far as the origins of ancient Egypt are concerned, they're usually traced back to a figure named Narmer, sometimes called Menes, and it's not clear, this is often true as we'll find in ancient civilizations around the world, whether Narmer was actually a real person or a mythical figure or a combination of both. So we're not entirely clear, but the records do indicate that this guy was around, or they're centering their civilization around this ancestor or pseudo ancestor. As Norman Cantor quoted already says, there's no real evidence of the existence of the legendary Menes or Narmer, but whatever his name, he established his palace on the Nile at Memphis, regarded by his countrymen not merely as a great political figure or a great warrior, but rather as a god whose rule over Egypt was part of the divine ordering of the universe. So they looked back on this figure, whether real or not, with reverence, and it's sort of his characteristics, his presence in a sense, was the centering mechanism of Egyptian society. And a precedent is set here that remains, and that is that Egyptian pharaohs were seen as and believed themselves to be, we think, gods. So the pharaoh described in the theology of the Egyptians as part of the creation of the world. We saw in Mesopotamia, and this is similar but more powerful now, that the Mesopotamian kings and emperors were seen as ruling with God's favor. They were ruling kind of divine right kings, as they're later called in European history. But the Egyptians are doing the Mesopotamians one better by saying, we're not just ruling with God's permission, with God's support, we are gods ourselves. How do we know that pharaohs actually believed they were gods? Well, we don't, and some of them may have doubted it, didn't believe it. But if you were told from the time you were a little kid that you were a god by everybody around you, wouldn't you believe it? You'd kind of want to believe it. So I kind of would assume that most of them probably did believe it because they wanted to, and it had been whispered in their ear as far back as they could remember. So starting with the Old Kingdom, you see the dates roughly there. So we're going back thousands of years here. Another map on the left that gives you a better look at some of the cities. Memphis, an early capital. Some of the artwork on the right. The all-powerful, all-knowing god-pharaoh of the Old Kingdom, right? We don't just mean one pharaoh. There were many pharaohs of the Old Kingdom through the first number of dynasties, sometimes referred to as the son of the sun. The Egyptian pharaoh's powerful symbol was the sun. In fact, in numerous ways, we don't need to get into the ways, but the pharaohs were associated with the sun. What better symbol to be associated with, as a king or an emperor, a pharaoh, than the sun? It's all powerful, it's radiant, it's bright, it's got all kinds of sort of features to it that if you can associate yourself with it, it makes you look good. So in some ways this is a propaganda victory for the pharaohs. I may have mentioned this in an earlier unit, but the pharaoh had, at least in the Old Kingdom, the power of what is known as authoritative utterance, which means if the pharaoh said it out loud, it's law. So if he says it out loud, it's law. It doesn't have to be written down per se, though it would be after the fact by somebody. It doesn't have to go through some sort of elected legislature and pass by majority vote. If he says it out loud, it's law. And I only sort of tell you that fact because it shows how much sort of snap your fingers top-down power pharaohs had, at least in the early to mid stages of this long-term empire. His person was the embodiment, or seen as the embodiment, of the world and divine order. So in the Egyptian way of thinking, the pharaoh is sort of right in there with all the other gods. Michael Mann again, all politics, all power, even all morality apparently resided with him, the pharaoh. So this is much more power in the hands of one person than we saw in Mesopotamia, for sure. And so the pharaohs did quite a job gathering the reins of power into their hands. Why did all this happen? Partly, I think, the unique geographical features, ecological situation, actually made for limited options for political structures, top-down, highly stratified societies with authoritative or authoritarian power at the top worked better in Egypt. Man, again, saying the Egyptian state was probably essential to the subsistence of its mass population. And we'll kind of get back to that in the next quote here. So the Egyptian state itself, meaning its government, showed a great deal of stability, at least once it got itself firmly entrenched in power. It did get overturned a couple times, but a couple times in 1,000 years of history, with comebacks each time, is quite impressive organization. So taking from what Professor Mann said in the sentence to the last slide, the Egyptian state was probably essential to the subsistence of the mass of its population. If the sources are to be believed, its two periods of disintegration, the two intermediate periods, brought famine, violent death, and even cannibalism to the land. They also brought regional diversity in pottery styles, lacking in other periods. The state's physical possession of the Nile communications infrastructure, foreign trade, and precious metals gave it a monopoly of resources essential to its subjects. The pharaoh controlled one consolidated organization chart centered on the Nile, uniting economic, political, ideological, and a modicum of political power. Military power. There is no alternative power network in social or territorial space, no system of potential alliances to be built up by the discontented that could enjoy a different power base than the Nile itself. So Mann is making the case here that this was a really tightly controlled top-down system. Organization chart is essentially kind of saying this is like a corporation where the CEO very much is in control or in charge from the top. And the other, I think, element in this quote that requires some explanation is the Nile communications infrastructure. The Nile River, the lifeblood of this rich and powerful civilization and empire, was, among other things, important for communications. So the fastest way to send messages as well as goods from one part of the kingdom to the other was through the boats on the Nile River, and the government controlled those almost entirely. So nobody could send messages faster than the government. In some ways, in some cases, or in most cases, nobody could send messages really at all other than the government. So the pharaoh and his state, his bureaucrats, civil servants, advisors, scribes, government officials, they sort of used the Nile to full advantage to consolidate and centralize power. In the Third Dynasty, we see, oops, I don't know how that slide got messed up there. My apologies. But it's in the Old Kingdom that you see the most impressive or the most famous pyramids being built. Here you see the largest tomb in the world, the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, and this was the product of the death and power of a pharaoh named Djoser in the Third Dynasty, again with the dates of life and death you see there. We'll get back to the pyramids. So power did break down the first time. Again, the dates you see there. And in this period, the pharaohs lost control, partly because of economic problems and issues, but independent states, as it says, with their own rulers developed throughout Egypt. So it's the government couldn't control things any longer, and what really happens here is regional nobles, right? Powerful people, usually powerful through the generations, hereditary power, sort of made their own little small kingdoms. So the place where a particular noble was from, used to calling many of the shots in that region, but not all of them, with the king over him. Now they're basically ruling as if they have their own little kingdom, and nobody calls the shots above them during the intermediate period. But the evidence does indicate that, as I said in one of the other slides, that these periods didn't work very well. And I said that sometimes decentralized power can work in the world, but this doesn't seem to have happened in Egypt. It appears that once Egypt was centralized under the top-down control of the pharaohs, it didn't function well without that structure being powerful and in place. So, with that said, won't be surprise you to know that the pharaohs make a comeback and usher in the Middle Kingdom. And here you see a number of famous pharaohs there, but after a 150-year hiatus, that first intermittent period was about 150 years, you do see centralization take control again. Mentuhotep, one of the most famous of all pharaohs, and we see a move from the capital from Memphis to Thebes, also on the screen. Mentuhotep of the 11th Dynasty is the guy who basically reunified Egypt after the intermediate period. He effectively centralized power and control again. He sort of appointed governors to Upper and Lower Egypt, which means kind of the northern half and the southern half. Although, oddly enough, we're used to seeing Upper, right, at least on a map, to be kind of at the top, north, and Lower to be at the bottom, south. But it's reversed in the case of Egypt. Upper Egypt is south on the map, and Lower Egypt is north on the map. Because in this case, what they mean by upper and lower is Upper and Lower Nile, the Nile River. So the Upper Nile, right, in the mountains, and it flows downward until it eventually empties into the Mediterranean from the Nile Delta. So that's Lower Egypt. So in a sense, they're kind of talking about going from mountains to flatlands. But it is weird when you see it on a map because it looks strange, since we're not used to, sort of those terms being used sort of in that directional way. The self-deification of the emperors continued here, and in some ways sort of reached new heights, which means the emperors declaring themselves and maybe believing themselves to be emperors. But this helped to bring the monarchy sort of back into full power. It was also during the 11th Dynasty and under Mentuhotep's rule that they successfully invaded Nubia for the first time to the south, which is the kingdom of Kush in that area. The second intermediate period comes down. This time, not so much because of a breakdown of centralized authority, although there was some of that, but mainly because of an outside invading group, the Hyksos, a diverse cultural group from Western Asia, and they settled in the Nile Delta. The Egyptians couldn't push them out, and this was a problem, of course. And what the Hyksos did, which is pretty smart, was rule all of Egypt without conquering anything but the Nile Delta. So they were able to send out representatives, governors, and the Egyptians were, at this point anyway, inferior in their weapons to the Hyksos, and so they had to bide their time, and they decided not to try to push them out of the Nile Delta. But truth be told, the Hyksos didn't conquer, at least physically, geographically, all of Egypt. They conquered just the Nile Delta. So you could actually say that Egypt, during its ancient period, was never conquered. So they fought their way into control of the Delta, having the advantage of horses, chariots, bronze weapons, and they had gotten these from afar. We know the Indo-Europeans look like they were the first to have these advantages, but they spread through diffusion, and the Hyksos got them before the Egyptians did. But the Egyptians eventually got them, as usually happens, and were able to kind of square things in time. The Hyksos, for a brief period, captured Memphis and forced the rest of Egypt to pay tribute to the capital. from far away. The New Kingdom. Where did my text go? All right, I have to go back and redo this. Something disappeared on me. So eventually the Hyksos are forced out, partially because, as I said, the Egyptians were able to acquire the same kind of weaponry, and even that part of the military situation between the two out. The new wrinkle that we see in the New Kingdom is that Egypt really went on a binge of expansion and empire for the first time. So we've been talking about Egypt as an empire since we started a few minutes ago, but it really only became an empire here in the New Kingdom. Empire in this sense meaning that they invaded other foreign lands and conquered them and incorporated them into their own territory. And they also, and these are related, increased trade. A great deal of trade as far away as Lebanon and Syria into the Middle East, and reading this from the slide, but silver, timber, wine, all the way across the Mediterranean to the other side of the Mediterranean, to Greece, and they traded for olive oil there. Nubia to the south gave them access to other kingdoms even further than Nubia, trading in ebony, leopard skins, ivory, gold, copper, other precious stones and metals. So this is a pretty widespread, lucrative, and complicated trading system that's put together by the New Kingdom. I wish I had the text because there's a great quote there, but I don't know where it is. In the 18th Dynasty, in the New Kingdom, you see the reign of Hatshepsut and Tuthmosis III, and this is a man and woman who appear to have ruled together as equals, or at least relatively so. Again, some of this stuff is not clear whether it's completely factual or myth, or how much is myth. These two people were real. It's just not the stories that we hear about them that we have as primary source documents. It's not always clear which of them are accurate and which might be stretching the truth, embellishing somewhat. Hatshepsut, sometimes referred to as the foremost of noble ladies, actually was the second woman to rule as pharaoh, but reigned for about 20 years. And actually reestablished many lost trade routes, so her foreign policy was successfully aggressive too. Again, what the New Kingdom is maybe most known for, going back to previous reigns. Many monuments and statues were built. Most Egypt museums have at least some of them today. So Hatshepsut was a crucial figure as leader in producing, or having produced, much of the great artwork that still remains today. Tuthmosis reigned for about 50 years, and for 20 years as co-ruler. And it was his conquests in Nubia, Syria, and Palestine that we mentioned before. So these two, an extraordinary, team that worked together, man and woman, to rule Egypt through kind of a crucial period in their later years, later empire, but still with Egypt being powerful and pushing that power outward. Amenhotep IV, 18th Dynasty, the dates you see there, and as Professor Perry says, quite simply, Amenhotep sought to replace traditional polytheism with the worship of Aten, a single god of all people, a supreme force in nature, represented as the sun disk. Amenhotep actually took the name Akhenaten, or servant of Aten, servant of that god, and moved the capital from Thebes to a newly constructed holy city. This is the thing that Amenhotep is most known for, and that is changing the religious belief system, or trying to anyway, moving Egypt from polytheism, belief in multiple gods, to belief in one god, god Aten. There's still a big debate amongst scholars about whether Amenhotep and his efforts religiously really do represent a move to true monotheism, or whether this was something short of that. Either way, it didn't have a long-term effect, because by the reign of the next pharaoh, that pharaoh moved Egypt right back to worshipping multiple gods or polytheism. And by the way, the next pharaoh that came after him that did that was a guy named Tutankhamun, or King Tut, the boy king, right? He's the guy whose tomb was found, and now all the riches sort of are in museums and tour the world all the time. I got to see them when I was about 13 years old, I think in San Francisco. But King Tut is famous only because we have all of the contents, or most of the contents, of his tomb. Another extremely important, powerful Egyptian pharaoh, Ramses II, in the 19th Dynasty, as one source has called it, a life of unparalleled luxury. So he's considered one of Egypt's greatest, if not the greatest of all pharaohs. Led many successful military campaigns. Again, the New Kingdom, probably more than anything else, known for its military success and aggression, and we've seen it now in a number of pharaohs. He also had huge temples, monuments, and statues built, quite modestly, mostly of himself. That's what I'd do if I was a pharaoh. I'd have everything built looking like me. Now moving to some of the cultural features of ancient Egypt. Egyptian writing, or Egyptian hieroglyphics. And you can see it's a pictorial system. Again, my slideshow got damaged here. That was larger. But pictographic symbols, and this is a good example of what we also saw in Mesopotamia. It's a different system of writing, but based on kind of the same principles. A pictorial or pictograph system means that there's hundreds, thousands of characters you have to memorize or know to be fluent in the language. This is part of the reason why, if you were fluent in the language and knew all these symbols, or most of them, you were automatically among the elite, because your skills were in demand. Because it was like getting a PhD to become even fluent in this written language. We think of the alphabet today as like nothing, no big deal, and we master it by the time we're, 5, if not before. Right, that's because it was a brilliant organizational system and simplification that's made communication and writing far, far easier. Not that the alphabet is the only such device, but the pictographic symbols here in Egypt and in Mesopotamia, and similar to ones in other places, were certainly important. It helped to organize religion, organize government, bureaucracy, certainly more so than if you have no writing, but it wasn't simple by any means. Norman Cantor, the genius of the Egyptians was expressed in the solution of practical problems rather than in sophisticated theoretical nuances. And you see this in some of the writing example you see here. So from their writings, from the primary source documents we have, and this is what Cantor is referring to, and that is that the Egyptians were kind of a more practical-minded people, not so much dealing with theory and abstractions, metaphysical questions, although there's some of that, but they were problem solvers. In some ways, we'll see something similar when we get to the Romans. The Romans were very much can-do, lawyers, businessmen, engineers, political leaders, and not so much philosophers. Egypt was a religious society, just like we saw in Mesopotamia, which we can say, and we'll say about every ancient society. And remember, as I said in our first unit, but this bears repeating all the way through. Give me a second, I have to take a sip here. So remember that there is reason to believe through numerous studies today that religion might be the most effective glue, so to speak, sort of keeping a society, a kingdom together, keeping it coherent, keeping it cohesive, and so forth. And in Egypt's case, this does seem to have also been true. This fits the pattern. Professor Perry, our beloved textbook author, said religion was omnipresent in Egyptian life and accounted for the outstanding achievements of Egyptian civilization. Religious beliefs were the basis of Egyptian art, medicine, astronomy, literature, and government. This also is often true, if not always true, of civilization, of people, that their sort of religion often is the main inspiration behind much of their cultural life, and even moves into what comes to be known as science. And we saw the latter in Mesopotamia also. Norman Cantor, again, he'll be my go-to guy for quotes for a number of units now. The multiplicity of temples gave rise to a priestly caste, meaning kind of a priestly hierarchy, which eventually became hereditary. Priests could pass on their powerful position as a priest to their son. Offerings to the gods, which comprised the revenue of the priests, enabled the temples to become a major political force in the state. So people were expected to bring offerings to the temples to the gods, which means like stuff and valuables. But since the gods never seemed to come and collect them, guess who got to keep them? The priests. Which sounds like a total scam, and you could say it was. But I think if we think of it as a scam, we're engaging in something I've cautioned us against many times, and that is in the sin of presentism. We're assuming that they thought about things the way we do today, and this sounds like a ripoff to us today, but I don't think it looked that way probably to anyone, especially the priests in those days. But even those that dropped off the offerings, however valuable they might have been, even if they knew, that the priest ended up pocketing the wealth, I don't think it raised an eyebrow. The value system was so religious, such a strong belief that the gods were real, that not appeasing them could have real serious consequences, that this wasn't seen as corrupt in any way, and so it wasn't corrupt. The Egyptians show in their literature, in the archaeology, in their primary source documents, a strong belief in an afterlife as well. And much of that we know from the temples, pyramids themselves, and what's inside them. As far as Egyptian values are concerned, they believed that the divine order was eternal, and the sort of main purpose in life was kind of to achieve harmony with the divine order. So in that sense, to bounce it off something it's not, to understand it better, the Egyptians their value system wasn't so much structured around the idea of we have to sort of always achieve more and more and more. They were practical-minded problem solvers, but it was mainly to sort of stay in harmony with nature, or feel like they were in harmony with nature or the universe. They had an optimistic outlook on life, and we've already seen that in Mesopotamia the opposite was true, and for opposite reasons. Remember, in ancient Mesopotamia, the Mesopotamians appear to have been pessimistic for two main reasons. One, the geography environment was such that the Mesopotamians were open to invasion from many different directions, and indeed did get invaded many times from multiple directions. And also the Tigris and Euphrates rivers flooded, but unpredictably. So they got caught in all kinds of problems with the crops, and leading to famine, because they could never predict or know when the floods were going to come. The principle of Ma'at, truth, justice, order, was taught primarily to bureaucrats, government civil servants, who used this principle to promote and keep themselves honest. Honesty was seen as consonant and crucial for efficiency. Government scribes were urged to work hard because they were considered to have the best lives. So their bosses, the pharaohs, would basically say, "Hey, look, you got it made, and so you better you better stay true to truth, justice, and order for the benefit of this kingdom, the benefit of this government." Certainly, the crowning achievement of Egyptian culture, at least culture in the narrow perspective of the word, is the pyramids, primarily from the Old Kingdom. And we'll look at sort of what they mean. So these incredible structures, still awe-inspiring today, considering that without modern technology, they managed to drag stones, sometimes a couple, 2.5, 3 tons in size each, across dozens and dozens of miles of desert, and stacked them on each other to make these gigantic structures. But this was the sort of most fantastic expression of the power of the pharaohs, their wealth, right? Because just think of the amount of labor they had to command to make this happen. So talk about centralized and hierarchical power, because this isn't going to happen, right? Those 3 or 4, those pyramids right there, aren't happening without centralization, which means you have control over a large population base and large geographical area, relatively speaking. And the Egyptian pharaohs government did, so you can get lots of workers and force them to work for you, as they did. And centralization or hierarchy means right, top-down power, as we know, and just the word pharaoh itself is almost synonymous with top-down power, authoritative utterance. Remember, so that pharaohs got these huge, sophisticated, astonishing engineering projects done, in part because they had that kind of power, had that large of a kingdom, so centralized, but top-down was crucial, because you weren't going to get volunteers to do this. You weren't going to do this democratically. We can today in the modern world do large-scale projects and engineering and otherwise economic, technological, democratically, but it was impossible then. So if you asked for a show of hands and asked who wants to go out and build my pyramid, my tomb, for when I die, you get nobody. So you just, as the pharaoh, just say, you are going out to build the pyramid, whether you like it or not. So, right, snap your fingers, top-down power. Michael Mann, again, quoting him one more time, "From this period date the largest man-made constructions the earth has yet seen, the pyramids. Their construction, without wheels, must have involved labor of a scale, intensity, and coordination hitherto unparalleled." And so these still astonish people today when they're seen in person or studied, in any amount of detail, because without modern technology, it does seem amazing. Although it's so amazing that it lends itself to a common problem in history, which is the paranoid, right? You know what I'm going to say. The paranoid idea that if you can't explain it, it must be aliens. And so this has been said by many people for a long, long time. So it's a conspiracy theory that's still out there to some degree. But you can look this up on, and you can Google it in a second and find all kinds of examples and of the technology they did use and how this was done. So it's not unknown, but it's still remarkable that they were able to pull it off, even when you see how they did it. As far as Egyptian culture is concerned, science, technology, literature, some rather remarkable advances here as well. And I'll just kind of read these. But they fashioned a system of geometry, so they're already pushing forward with advanced mathematics for the day. Did advanced engineering, as we already saw, pyramids, other such structures. In medicine, identified illnesses correctly, much of the time anyway, realized that uncleanliness led to contagion. They didn't know why, but they put 2 and 2 together and knew that it did. They had some understanding of human anatomy. They even did operations. That part does sound scary. And none of that sounds, of course, impressive to us. But keep in mind, we're talking about thousands of years ago. Just the fact that they were, took the time, effort to pay attention and identify different and separate illnesses, that's actually a major step forward, as basic as it sounds to us today, and it's really basic. As Professor Perry says, making it sound even more impressive, and I think he's right, Egyptian doctors examined the body in a scientific way already. So that's saying something. One of the great pieces of literature of the ancient Egyptians has the great name, the Book of the Dead, which is full of hymns, litanies, and religious writings to guide the deceased between life and afterlife. So it's a piece of literature, but it actually had practical value as well. It was a guide to the after world. Remember, the Egyptians clearly believed in an afterlife, which is not uncommon worldwide at the time and since. They wrote love poetry, they wrote fantasy works, adventure stories, so they got quite creative with their different genres of writing and writing styles. The prevailing theme throughout all of these cultural achievements is that the divine order, so the universe controlled by the gods, is eternal, and one must achieve, again, harmony with it. So that word harmony comes back again, maybe as sort of the main value. Just like in the U.S. today, if we had to pick out one word that explains our value system, historically anyway, it would clearly be liberty or freedom. I mean the same thing. In Egypt, it's harmony. This brings us to the Bantu migrations and early agricultural societies in Sub-Saharan Africa, which means south of the Sahara Desert. So the Sahara Desert in the northern fourth of the continent. Below that is Sub-Saharan Africa. The Bantu migrations, which you can see in the map on the left, started around in West Africa, Cameroon, Nigeria, that area. And from the arrows, you can see this group of people migrated and spread far and wide, and ended up marrying into different cultural groups, ethnic groups that they found in one region or another. But the Bantu speaking peoples, once again, we see language as one of the key elements of evidence in sort of knowing where they moved and what they did, which we'll get to. But this group had a tremendous influence everywhere they went. They blended in many cases and did intermarry, but their way of life, some of their technology, their customs also influenced the peoples that they came across and settled with, not always without opposition. They also, as we'll see, borrowed and learned from other peoples that they came in contact with as well. So starting in that sort of little pink area there in Africa, immigration became preferable to a continued life as a perpetual junior in an overcrowded homeland, meaning that there were lots of different competing groups right in that region, and they weren't one of kind of the oldest ones. And so they kind of lacked a certain amount of power in that part of the world, which may have been part of the reason that they decided to go elsewhere, or they could have more say, in another environment. Quoting from Professor Stavrianos, wrote another good textbook that I sometimes use on world history. He says the movement of the Bantu peoples from West Africa to Central, Eastern, and Southern Africa has often been described as a migration, but it was a gradual movement of small numbers of peoples who often intermarried with the people in the areas they infiltrated. The Bantu were in the area of the Congo by the 5th century BCE, but the widespread use of iron between the 2nd and 5th centuries CE allowed the Bantu to move more quickly to the rest of the southern portion of the continent. The Bantu people's knowledge of agriculture, in my own words here, spread to much of Sub-Saharan Africa, and again, they picked up agricultural knowledge from the peoples they ran into as well. So in yet another area, we see that agriculture becomes the economic backbone or foundation of a society. And we know also that agricultural peoples tend to move hunter-gatherers with other ways of life out of the way. So, like we saw with the Indo-Europeans, we know much of what we know about the Bantu peoples from the language family that they were a part of, the Niger-Congo language family. And the map there is, the language map is pretty complicated. Quoting from a book called First Farmers, The Origins of Agricultural Societies, the author says, the Niger-Congo language family is the largest in the world in terms of number of languages, 1,436 according to one source, with possibly 300 million speakers. That would be now. People are speaking a language or a language derivative of one of the original Niger-Congo languages. The whole family of languages, and especially its Bantu subgroup, so Bantu is a subgroup of this larger family, covers a vast area of Sub-Saharan Africa with almost no survivals of substratum languages, which means they basically just wiped out all the other languages. I mean, languages don't actually fight battles with each other, but for whatever reason, this language became the dominant one through much of Africa. All the brown areas you see there, which is like the southern half of Africa, or most of the southern half, in time became one or another of the Bantu languages. There's really kind of two social groups here, or two migratory groups here. The Western Bantu, again quoting the same source, with pottery, oil palms, and yams, perhaps moving southward in the West African rainforest, getting there by around 3,000 years ago, and eventually moving into the savannas of Angola, which is kind of the southwest Africa, and the rainforest region being quite densely settled, probably by about 1,000 years ago. The Eastern Bantu, and we saw on the previous map, the arrows going out to the right. The Eastern Bantu, the arrows going straight down from the little dots around Nigeria or Cameroon, represent the Western movements. So the Eastern Bantu groups began to spread eastward along the northern fringes of the rainforest to reach Lake Victoria by around 3,000 years ago. There they came in contact with cattle herders and millet cultivators. Millet is a type of grain, and also with hunter-gatherers. From the former groups, the adoption of sorghum and pearl millet to add to their predominantly tuberous domesticated plant roster. Tuberous basically means they're eating tubers or things that sort of plants that grow sort of down into the ground, not above the ground. They also acquired iron metallurgy, and a little later added cattle, sheep, donkeys, and chickens. So this is already pretty much a full panoply of domesticates. So the Bantu peoples were on their way to a more complex lifestyle through these developments. The Bantu dispersal, again the same source, was one of the most dramatic examples of farming dispersal in world history, and there is quite remarkable agreement between the archaeological and linguistic records on its reality. So, among other impressive features, just the sheer amount of territory that they covered and spread into successfully is quite astonishing. As far as social structure in Bantu societies is concerned, again, I'll read a quote and then comment on it, comment as I go along, this time from our beloved textbook authors, Bentley and Ziegler. Most Bantu and other peoples lived in communities of a few hundred individuals led by chiefs. Many groups known as age sets or age grades, consisting of individuals born within a few years of one another, members of each age set jointly assumed responsibility for tasks appropriate to their levels of strength, energy, maturity, and experience. During their early years, members of an age set might perform light public chores. At maturity, like because they, reached like 18, whatever it would be, the equivalent thereof, members jointly underwent elaborate initiation rites that introduced them to adult society. Older men really means kind of men kind of in their adult prime, cultivated fields and provided military service, while women tended to domestic chores and traded at markets. In later years, members of Hatshepsut served as community leaders and military officers. So this is something rather unique, and that is I mean, we talk about age cohorts, the baby boomers and Generation X and millennials, etc. But this isn't so much an attempt by the Bantu to sort of understand how their societies are developing, because they didn't see them in the same way developing like we do today. But it was a way for I'll read from the slide on the left and comment. Each age set passes together through clearly identified life stages, such as warrior or elder. Ceremonies mark the passage of each new stage. Men and women both go through different age sets. So this is a way, I think, to maybe to best understand it, to provide structure and stability in people's lives, knowing that they're going from kind of one milestone to the next, and basically knowing what's expected of them because of those milestones. From a young age, they would already know, which stage you went to, and what they're kind of preparing for. And so with rituals and rites of passage, then each group, as it sort of gets to the next stage, understands their place in the larger scheme of the social system and the society. Looking at not just Bantu but Sub-Saharan African religious practices and beliefs, we see kind of a number of things that stand out. One, which surprises a lot of people, is that some African groups, actually many of them, believed in a monotheistic, impersonal deity, monotheistic one God that they saw as a source of good and evil both. So different than the Christian God in that sense, but they did see, many of them did sort of believe in one, at least, all-powerful God. Sometimes they believed in multiple, less powerful gods at the same time. The creator, again, in some African traditions, the creator being stepped away after creation and didn't intervene in the universe, which is also amazing because this is somewhat similar to the European deists, who believe kind of the same thing. There was a god that created the universe, but then left immediately after, never to return, leaving humans on their own. African peoples generally didn't pray directly to God. They prayed to specific spirits. And so they believed that the single all-powerful deity could take the form of this spirit or that spirit. This type of religion is sometimes referred to as animism. You see it in Native American societies if you study U.S. history. So the belief was that spirits were invisible, but they lived right there with you, right there with the people. They weren't sort of distant gods sort of up in heaven somewhere. The spirits were right there. Many African peoples prayed to both ancestor and personal spirits, and the spirits, unlike sort of a monotheistic God, and sometimes they believed in both, the spirits did intervene in the world, and I already said they dwelt amongst the people. So it's the spirits that can intervene and have an effect on your life or the life of the community. The larger, bigger God, I guess, has bigger things to do. So animism, by the way, also includes a belief that religion and human life is very much tied to nature. These are very much nature-based religions, unlike Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, in which God is sort of much more remote from his creation and from human beings as part of that. Bentley and Ziegler, our authors, again, say proper attention, meaning rituals done by priests, to these spirits would ensure good fortune. Their neglect would bring punishment or adversity from disgruntled spirits. So this also is a common feature of animistic religions, like Native Americans again. The religious rituals and rites, ceremonies that they do, are often done kind of for selfish reasons. I don't mean selfish for one individual, but selfish for the group. And I don't really mean selfish in a bad way. What I mean is that they would do ceremonies to get particular outcomes in their actual community life that helped the society, that helped the group. So a certain, and this is famous around the world, but a certain set of rituals, dances, incantations done by a priest. That's what he's supposed to do. He's an expert in. If he does them the right way, it brings plentiful rainfall. So there's a lot of crops, a lot of food to eat. If say the group is threatened by warfare, some invading group, another set of rituals and practices done in a different way that are supposed to bring good luck and good fortune in warfare. So it's selfish in that sense that the way you do religious ceremonies is supposed to bring a practical, real-world outcome. It's similar, I guess, to praying in a sense, but this is kind of the heart of such religions. Orthopraxy, which you see at the bottom of the screen, means proper conduct or proper practice. And though we can see from what's above on the screen and what I just said that these African religions had beliefs, it's the practices that really counted more than the beliefs. So proper practice or conduct is orthopraxy. Proper belief is orthodoxy, a word you probably have heard before. And so the Christians, the Hebrews, we'll get to later on, for instance, they also had, a combination of beliefs and practices in their religion, going to church, etc. But say in Christian religion, orthodoxy, proper belief, comes first, and proper practice, orthopraxy, comes second. Not a distant second, but second. But in animistic religions around the world, including Africa, it's shifted the other way, at least slightly. Proper practice, orthopraxy, comes first. Proper belief, orthodoxy, comes second.